My name is Emily Mannix, and I'm going to start a presentation for you guys about Pluto and whether or not it is a planet. So, to start, okay, sorry. So, to start off, I'm going to talk about the history. So, the discovery of Pluto was by Percival, or it wasn't discovered by him, but Percival Lowell. He wanted to find a planet X, which was Pluto, but he was never able to. So, after his death, another astronomer named Clyde Tombaugh, he was the one that discovered Pluto. He spent years searching for it, and he kind of fulfilled the wishes of what Lowell wanted. A fun story about it was that Clyde didn't name Pluto himself, but a girl named Venetia did after her class learned about it and her grandfather wrote about it. And I guess back then, Pluto becoming the ninth planet was a very big deal, and people didn't really know how to think about it because the original connotation was about it being a laxative, since there was something called a Pluto laxative, and then the next the next step towards Pluto kind of becoming more garnered and well known in the United States was Walt Disney creating the little dog Pluto to be Mickey Mouse's friend. And below were just two pictures of Percival Lowell in his habitat. And then, so about Clyde Tombaugh was that he originally was not an astronomer. He was born into a family that he was for him to be part of a farm and not really for him to be doing anything with his life. So he's very poor. He didn't have much to build himself off of. But once he discovered Pluto, he went huge places. He got a scholarship for college, and he was able to keep looking for more planets. While he unfortunately was unable to, discovering Pluto was a pretty big deal. So a lot of the information that I'm gathering right now and in this PowerPoint is from Neil Tyson's The Pluto Files. And Neil Tyson, I guess, proclaimed himself as the man who sparked the controversy of whether or not Pluto was a planet. Because in his planetarium, he had a physical representation of all the planets spaced out accordingly, and Pluto was not there. He had put Pluto like downstairs on a wall against a bunch of other places, and that's kind of what to him started off the questions of what was going on about Pluto. So Tyson went to he had a lot of colleagues, and these colleagues kind of, as I put above, put a lot of the pros and cons of what they thought Pluto to be. And as you can see on the left, pros was that some of his colleagues said that size is less important than shape, and that Pluto basically has all the characteristics that other planets have, such that it has bright and dark areas, that it's a textured surface, it's round, it has atmospheres, and while we can't see it as well as other planets, it's visible. While, but then the cons from the similar colleagues was that it was too small. It had a lot of outliers compared to the planets, like that had a tipped orbit, and that it it wasn't as when it orbited the sun, it wasn't as circular, and that it crossed the orbits of other planets. So in this regard, these were just based off of like the personal opinions of astronomers and fellow colleagues of Tyson. Now, what really started off the controversy about Pluto was the two astronomers, David Jewett and Jane Liu, found the Kuiper Belt in 1992. And what the Kuiper Belt was, as described to you, was that it was the leftover formation of the solar system. So there's our solar system, and in the picture, there was the Kuiper Belt. And the Kuiper Belt was basically full of everything similar to the size of Pluto, if not smaller. And that was what kind of started the question of, do we want to call Pluto or not? Because if it's part of the Kuiper Belt, is it a planet, or can we still consider Pluto part of our solar system? And now, after the discovery of the Kuiper Belt, Mike Brown discovers Eris, and from Eris is essentially Pluto, but bigger. And so he thinks that he's found the 10th planet. So he goes forward, tells everyone, and thinks that this is like the next big thing, like he's able to do it, it's amazing. But then the International Astronomical Union, they kind of decide everything about the sky, essentially. and they could not accept that Eris was a planet because there was no exact definition. So they gathered a committee to decide, and that committee, which actually happened to be someone in it, was one of Tyson's friends who was interviewed. They decided the definition would be planets should be round and orbit the sun. However, this allowed many planets to become part of this. So what happened was that Pluto kind of felt it was kind of in a gray area where the definition allowed them to be part of our galaxy, or I mean our solar system, but that also meant that any other planet like Eris and like a bunch of others were also going to be part of it. So in order to kind of meet in the middle, well, not meet in the middle, because the IAU decided to reject that definition, and then they made up their own, and that was called that it was basically a planet must clear the neighborhood around its orbit. But that was hard because Pluto was so small that when it orbited, it didn't necessarily clear out everything around it, which essentially invalidated Pluto as a planet. So now instead of having 10 planets with Eris, we had 9 with Pluto, but then Pluto was taken off. So now we just have 8 planets, and that caused a lot of controversy. And so after further research, Pluto is essentially a dwarf planet. It contains everything that planets like Earth and Venus and Mars has, but it's a smaller version. It can be just the analogy was that a Chihuahua is still a dog. Like yes, a Chihuahua is very very small, but it's still classified under the department of being a living breathing animal and part of a dog classification. And one of the major things to kind of come out of this was that planets form by they're compared to us like as embryos. They start smaller and become bigger and bigger and bigger. And I guess gravity pulled Pluto and kind of thrust it into the Kuiper Belt, disconnecting it from the food supply, which is why every planet or dwarf planet in the Kuiper Belt is that size, is because they don't have a connection to what they need, which is like their matter and become bigger, which is why they're the size they are. So I guess in conclusion, I've put down the 3 points that I've gone over. The physical qualifications of do we think that what Pluto has compared to all the other planets is similar, and basically we can validate it as a planet. And then it depends on how I guess you interpret the Kuiper Belt, because the Kuiper Belt kind of shows the distinction of what Pluto really is, but do we still want to consider Pluto as part of what we are? And then the IAU definition obviously denies Pluto being a planet. And I guess these 3 big points that I brought up during the presentation and what I'm talking about now is kind of what I personally thought of as how I would consider if Pluto was a planet or not. And in my opinion, I I grew up where Pluto was a planet, and then when we found out it wasn't, to me it wasn't that big of a deal. But after watching the videos and kind of going through some information, I still think that Pluto, I think like inherently, I think Pluto is a planet just because it's so ingrained in me that, oh, we have 9 planets and Pluto is one of them. But based off it, it's really up to your interpretation because as you can tell, like each point that I've put out here, they kind of have different pros and cons to them in itself, which kind of makes it a little more confusing. But I would like to say that Pluto is a planet and that the physical qualifications, while yes, it is a miniature version and technically is a dwarf planet, it should still be considered part of our world. And I guess the IAU definition, to me, that was far too vague. They could have definitely put in a much bigger, more prompt, or finite definition of what should be considered and should not be considered a planet. And while we don't take planets lightly of whether they should be part of us or not, I think Pluto should be. I guess I don't know. I think that Pluto definitely has its obviously has its limitations compared to us, but it still is able to kind of hold itself against us independently, positively. And then I guess my last slide is just that the kind of the summarization of everything is that science is always changing, and while the IAU still believes that Pluto is not a planet, and obviously there's tons and tons of information out there of whether or not Pluto is, there's things are always changing and happening, and there's not, I guess the final point in this is that not everything is definite. You can learn something new. We could honestly discover a new planet like this afternoon or something, but I guess to keep your mind open and be able to understand that things out there are there there's a huge world out there for us, and we shouldn't discredit it just because it's not necessarily exactly what we're looking for or the exact um, classification that we want, but rather something different and unique that we can look forward to having. So, yeah, that's it. And I hope you guys learned a little bit about the history of Pluto and kind of the standpoints and pros and cons of how people believe to be what Pluto is as a planet. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a good day.